Direction of Fiona and Max, who really are great leaders of our group, and it's also an opportunity on this International Day Against Homophobia to pay tribute to Sonal and Fiona and their colleagues in the Equalities bit of HR here at UCL, who do sterling work in our support. There's, on the BBC website this morning, there was the results of a Europe-wide survey which showed that 25% of the respondents had experienced abuse, threats and violence, even though they don't actually report it. So if that's still the case in a Europe where those of us who are members of the LGBT community enjoy, in legal terms, unprecedented protections, one has to imagine what it's like elsewhere. Anyway, there is nobody better qualified to talk about this subject than Professor Michael King. The last time he talked to a group during what was then LGBT History Month, we had a good turnout as we got today. And that is a great pleasure. And what Michael has to say to us will be authoritative, interesting and rewarding. So Michael, over to you.
All right, thanks. Can you hear me? I think this is mainly for recording, is it? But you can hear me anyway. Right. Okay. Well, I'm going to give probably my view of homophobia, and particularly coming from the psychiatric field, and so therefore it's going to have that slant, only because I think psychiatrists have been among the vanguard of people to promote discrimination, if you look historically. So what I'm going to do is go through what I think homophobia is, not too much into that, but more in looking at, well, on this day against homophobia, what can be done about it, because that's probably as important as anything. So I want to just look at what are the forms of homophobia that we see, because we often hear about the violence and insults and things that gay, lesbian and transgender people get, but there's far more subtle forms of homophobia than that. And then how they've been rolled back. And I'm going to try and put to you a kind of story, and this is going to be a very big skim across history and modern events, because it's a big and complex field, homophobia, actually. It takes in a huge number of different historical aspects. And try to make a story of how research, together with activism, has been the driving force behind some of this, and then getting into legal and political change that's led to greater openness. Openness is a very modern thing. To be open about being gay or lesbian is a very modern phenomenon. And you'll see that not long ago it was extremely hard to be open. And then a bit about what people have tried to do in interventions to reduce it. Because there's political and legal change, and then there are these interventions. So if I move on, the context is very important, because this country has recently been voted as the top one out of 43 mainly European countries in terms of rights for gay and lesbian people, lack of discrimination. And of course London is probably the most gay-friendly part of the top country. So we're sitting in a very unique environment. So when I talk about harassment and these sorts of issues here or in England as well as abroad, we're sitting in the best position. And most other countries are in a worse position. And I've been in conferences where I've talked about this and people say, oh, well, you know, you're talking from England, it's a completely different picture, what we face. So just to keep that in mind. First of all, I want to start with pictures, because I think pictures are better than words about what homophobia is. Many of you will be familiar with this. It's only a very short clip, but it says a lot.
Hello, mate. Mate, don't you know this is a Muslim area?
Well, you can't see it very well, sorry. I think anybody can control. Turn the lights off. Yeah.
Why are you dressed like that for? Why are you dressed like that for? Because you're walking through a Muslim area, dressed like a fag, mate. You need to get out of it. Yeah, get out of it quicker then.
Well, I don't think we need to go on too much with that to see what that's like. And in case any of you are thinking I'm becoming Islamophobic instead of homophobic, we have the next example of this.
David Cameron has said more than once that society is stronger when we make vows to each other and support each other, which is why he supports, one of the reasons why he supports gay marriage. And the government's about to begin a period of consultation, leading, he hopes, to a change in the law which would make it legal The opposition is rallying, and now one of Britain's most senior Catholics, Cardinal Keith O'Brien, has said the idea is grotesque and would shame the country. He's on the line from Edinburgh. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
People may say you, as a church leader, are perfectly entitled to have your views about gay marriage, but this sort of language is simply inflammatory.
I don't think it's inflammatory at all. I think I'm simply handing on the teaching of the Christian Church for almost 2,000 years, for over 2,000 years since Christ was on earth, handing on his same teaching and doing my best to hand it on in a way that many people can hear it.
Grotesque?
Yes.
Shaming the country?
Indeed.
Okay, we've seen enough of that. And so, you know, I think pictures often sum up what it's about from two different kinds of angles. One, that violent kind of street angle, but the second, well, I was going to say more subtle, but it's probably less subtle, institutional angle, and we'll come back to that. So what is it? Well, very quickly, it's pretty obvious to most people what it is. It's discrimination, prejudice, exclusion. And transgender people come into exactly the same bracket because there's the same sort of moral outrage against them. What's really important, and I'm going to come back to that, is the severity of this within families, because often within traditional societies or with traditional families in Western societies, the exclusion is of the whole family. And often parents are extremely concerned for their place in the social context. And it's an idea, if some of you are familiar with social capital, where social capital can be extremely restricting and very severe, not in a positive sense to the people who break it. And then this one, which I'm not going to talk much about because it's very controversial anyway, whether gay and lesbian people internalize some sense of shame. I think a lot of the time we misinterpret that it's actually just sensible concealment in a hostile environment. So we've got this overt harassment and exclusion, but then we have the much more subtle forms. This is just very quickly, and following up on you, this is a 2000, what Stephen said, you know, we have these surveys, and this is one back in 2008. Most of them show very similar results even since then. 1 in 5 people report some sort of homophobic hate crime or incident in the previous 3 years. But what you really see here is that they don't report it. The reporting is far, far less than, say, the British Crime Survey. And most people don't report it to anyone, which is extraordinary. Now, the Metropolitan Police just issued a statement saying that these homophobic hate crimes have dropped in London over the last year by about 12 or 13%. Come in.
Sorry.
And, but of course, they're not taking into account that most of them are not reported in the first place. So what about this, though? When we get into these, this has probably dropped a bit since I did this slide, although it's not really understood. It's a bit over 75 or 80 countries, certainly, but the laws are very subtle, as you'll begin to see, and new laws are being introduced all the time in some countries against. But it's a lot of countries where same-sex behaviour in some form or another is criminalised. The ones I'm even more interested in are these institutionalised forms, where the Church of England is a real exemplar of this sort of thing, as I'm going to demonstrate in a minute. But just very briefly, because it's the area that I'm involved in and I'll come back, medical diagnosis has been one of the worst areas of this, and it's not gone away. Some of you may have heard of, or I hadn't until recently, the House magazine or the House Journal, which is a journal every month for MPs. And this advertisement has been placed in the current one. If I just put up the lights a little bit. This is an attack on us. When ideology replaces science, this is circulated among all the MPs at the present time, saying the evidence that comes from the Royal College of Psychiatrists and from the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy is crap, basically, that we're pushing ideology rather than science. And these are the group, some of you will be very familiar with this, that were stopped putting an advertisement on London buses saying, we're ex-gay, get over it, that sort of thing. Which I thought they should have actually been allowed to put it on the buses, but because it could have then been laughed at, but they weren't able to. And I'll come back to humour, because I think humour is very important in this fight. Anyway, these are the, and I've shown this once before in UCL, it's just incredible, really. This is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, and these are all the different diagnoses that were given for homosexuality as a medical illness from the 50s onwards. But you can see here in 1973 it was removed as a diagnosis, and I'll tell you how that happened, because that very much is a mixture of activism and research. But the current international classification of diseases across Europe still contains something called ego-dystonic sexual orientation, and this is the definition. It's where the gender identity is, it's all mixed up. We've got gender identity in here, and sexual preference is not in doubt, but the individual doesn't like it. So you can be heterosexual apparently and want to be homosexual. Now if anyone's met a person like that, I'd really like them to refer them to me, because I've not come across that. Obviously it's still aimed at this kind of issue, and that is still in our current list of diagnoses. But the Church of England is in the vanguard of this sort of thing at the moment. Now, as many of you, if you follow this, and particularly the Anglican Communion, this document, Issues in Human Sexuality, a statement by the House of Bishops, anyone wanting to enter the priesthood or become a vicar has to give assent, verbal or non-verbal assent to this document. And this document says, well, don't tell anyone, don't engage in any sexual activity if you happen to be a gay clergyman. It boils down to don't ask, don't tell in some areas of the country, but worse than that, so it's very difficult to get through, to get into training if you wanted to do. And then when you're in training, if you happen to be in a civil partnership or have a partner, that is not taken any account of, so your fees are much, much higher than if you happen to be married. These are all just subtle forms of exclusion. This sort of thing used to go on in psychoanalysis. If you wanted to be trained in psychoanalysis and you happened to be a gay or lesbian therapist, you couldn't do it. You were excluded because you were considered abnormal or retarded in your development. And that occurred up until at least the 1990s, and there's some evidence that that sort of exclusion may still be going on. So what could address this? Well, what I want to argue today is that I think research is very important here for dispelling the myths about homosexuality and pathology, but activism goes hand in hand with that. It's very, very important. If you look at the history of this, it's led to this political change, even a tiny bit, there's meant to be David Cameron there, a tiny bit of political leadership. The marriage thing has made him very unpopular. There has been a degree of political leadership. This has led to greater openness, and I think this is one of the most crucial things of all. But it's very difficult for gay and lesbian people to be open, particularly famous gay and lesbian people, and even more particularly sportsmen and women who happen to be gay and lesbian, if something like this hasn't gone on before. And as you'll see in a minute, the courage of people in earlier generations is what changed things, although it took particular courage. So the examples, in my field, sexology, people began about the 50s to say, look, homosexuality seems to be a normal variant of behaviour, it isn't an illness, and we had these famous Kinsey reports that showed that same-sex behaviour was very common, and then it went on. One person who's particularly, if you know the history of this field, particularly famous is a woman, Evelyn Hooker, who in the 1950s produced a paper. It was in psychoanalytical terms, but it said it compared gay men and straight men in a study of their personality. You can argue whether you agree with the psychoanalytical concepts involved, showing that they were completely normal adjustment. There was no difference in adjustment. This caused a furore and an outrage that how could anything be said like this, because of course it was assumed that homosexuals were ill by definition. And it led on to other papers that followed hard on the heels that said, well, maybe there's more depression and anxiety among gay men and lesbian because of the horrendous discrimination they faced in the 1950s particularly. And these were famous papers here, a very brave psychoanalytical paper, a bit like Evelyn Hooker saying there's nothing wrong with these men if you take away the stress and discrimination they're facing. They don't need psychoanalysis. We've done a lot of research in this area going on from that in a particular area that's led to a lot of change in this country and other countries about treatments. I'm not going to go into any of this in detail, but this is the background of this group who hate us, the core issues group, some of you may know, who want to promote treatments to make homosexuals heterosexual. There's a lot of evidence now, not just from our group, from other groups that, if anything, is as high.